Hello and welcome to another edition of AP US History, University High School. We're going to take some notes here and talk about the presidency of Jimmy Carter, who was a one-term president and took office after Gerald Ford, who was the successor to Richard Nixon. Gerald Ford has the dubious distinction of being the only president to not be elected into office. He was never elected. That is, he was never on the vice presidential ticket either. Okay, so let's talk about Jimmy Carter and some of the domestic and foreign policy wins and losses for this president. So first of all, his term was 77 to 81, so he's elected in 1976, the late 70s. The 70s were a pretty turbulent period as well. Some pretty high drug use in America. I don't know, when you look at divorce rates, they start going up, abortion rates start going up, STD rates start going up in this decade, the 70s. So it might be, I don't know, the aftermath, if you will, of the 60s perhaps. So facts about Carter. First of all, he is from Georgia. He's a peanut farmer from Georgia. Well, that's what he originally was, or that's what his family business was. A Democrat, very famous for being a born-again Christian openly. And a lot of people probably elected him because of his character, his dedication to integrity, just the kind of person he was, morally, in terms of like his character. And you could see that that's possibly a reaction against maybe the kind of person that Richard Nixon was. And Americans' experience with him and the Republican Party as a result of Watergate, right? So let's move on to major issues. So first of all, this slide is just kind of an overview. He's kind of an outsider, and he's not like this cutthroat Washington-type politician. Again, I don't know, he's a nice man. How about we say that? He's a nice man. But as a result, many people believe that he was an ineffective president. When I went to China, visited, and there was a picture of Jimmy Carter meeting with Deng Xiaoping, and that was like the first time that we'd formally reopened relations with China diplomatically. Our guide said, "Oh, look, Jimmy Carter, smilingly, a good president." And one of my teacher colleagues there said, "No, very nice man, but bad president." So, well, let's see why. During his presidency, the country experienced some very bad economic issues. Very high inflation, high interest rates at the same time. That is almost never the case. You either have high inflation. Well, no, actually, wait. Let's see. No, yeah, that's right. So inflation, high interest rates, and then growing energy costs will explain why some of the stuff. Gas shortages, a general sense of uncertainty, and then a decline in American manufacturing as Japan increased in that area and began to overtake the United States in certain categories, and that golden age of the 50s was going away. What were some of his goals as a president? He wanted to reduce America's energy use. He actually was the first president to install some solar panels on the roof of the White House, which were probably very inefficient at that time in 1977, 78, whenever it was, because the next president, who was considered, I don't know, the darling of the Republican Party and of modern conservatism, Ronald Reagan, had them taken down. Achieving energy independence for the United States, that is not depending on the Middle East, and reducing the role of corporations in American politics. He believed that they were too influential. Internationally, his presidency was marred by issues related to the Middle East, but he achieved some successes there. He also tried to introduce America to the age of limits, and I will explain what that is in a future slide as well. So environmental concerns. Some environmental wins is that they passed this Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. So a lot of Alaskan land was set aside for conservation. It's some of the most pristine and beautiful land in the world. People from all around the world go there to photograph it and to hike it and to camp. So protected about 100 million acres of land, double the size of the nation's park and wildlife refuge system. So you do need to associate him with like the environmental movement. But also, some really nasty things happened, environmentally, that is, during his presidency. In 1979, there was this, we can't call it a disaster like Chernobyl was in 1986, whenever it was, but this mishap where At 3 Mile Island, 3 Mile Island it's a little small island, I think, in the middle of a lake or something. Um, in, I think, Pennsylvania. It was a nuclear power plant where some radiation was released. The public grew very concerned about the safety of nuclear power. As a result, the core of this reactor, I think, started to melt down, um, or to start, yeah, and which was very dangerous. To reassure the public after the whole incident, Jimmy Carter and a whole entourage went to take a tour of 3 Mile Island. And when they left, and they had all their suits, the hazmat suits on, protective suits, and then they used that geigometer or whatever it is to measure the radiation level on him and all the people there, as like proof that everything was fine, and it actually showed really high levels of radiation. But then somebody adjusted the instrument, and apparently it was fine. But still, I think that's funny. A separate issue at Love Canal in New York was revealed that chemicals that a company had dumped seeped through the ground and were linked to really high rates of birth defects in New York. That's Love Canal. And as a result, that this whole town, which is very working class, tried to start like a class action lawsuit against that company, and they actually eventually won because this environmentalist movement really begins to grow. And then I'll show you another incident. So experts warned that there were these kinds of toxic waste sites all around the country. But 3 Mile Island and Love Canal are two that you need to know. So there's 3 Mile Island, I think it's Pennsylvania, and here's the president's visit in 1979, 80. Look at all those pants. Look at all those bell bottoms. Man. This is a picture of a river. What do you notice that is interesting about this river? If you said it's on fire, you'd be correct. You are a good observer. This is the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. It's famous for, in the late 50s or early 60s, catching fire. Why? Because it was full of all sorts of chemicals and toxins and oils that were dumped into the river by various companies right there. Ohio, Western New York, Pennsylvania, that area is now, of course, nicknamed the Rust Belt, right? It was where some of like our original Second Industrial Revolution steel and other plants were established. But before the EPA and other agencies like that, regulations were very, very lax. So the EPA, Congress, I think through the EPA, created something called super funds. Super funds. These are like funds of a lot of money to clean up environmental disasters. So in 1986, I think 87, the big spill off the coast of Alaska of the Exxon Valdez oil tanker. That required an EPA super fund to clean up the beaches there and other disasters like that in the future. As well, presidency of Jimmy Carter also was marred by very nasty economic problems. The worst economic problems of the second half of the 20th century. How about that? Since World War II. By the late 1970s, interest rates on a home was 17%. That's out of control. By early 1980, it was somewhere like 22%. A good rate is considered like 4% today. So, for example, a 30-year mortgage of $100,000 went up in the 1950s from about $421 to $1,425 per month. That's like five-fold increase. No, fourfolding, 3.5 times increase. That's absurd. So 17% for a home mortgage loan. So that's a symptom of very, very high inflation. High oil prices as well marred this period. So U.S. passenger cars were getting like 13 miles to the gallon. They're basically boats on wheels. And what further made that worse was this oil crisis of 1979. Part of that had to do with the Iranian Revolution. Part of it throughout the whole 70s had to do with, in 1973 and 1974, the Yom Kippur War between Israel and a few of its Arab neighbors. The Netherlands, the United States, they openly supported Israel in that war, and OPEC placed an oil embargo on many countries in the West. that had devastating economic effects globally. Here in 1979, the Iranian Revolution that further spikes the price of oil. So to urge conservation, the president talked about an age of limits, that is, trying to get Americans to limit their use of gasoline. And Americans didn't really want to hear that. This is America. I mean, it's America. You know what I mean? So they kind of saw the president as a lecturer. Yes, he was a man of integrity and character, but he's telling them he's telling them don't be American in some ways. Look at these cars. This thing is massive. Half these cars probably get like 10, 12 miles to the gallon. As opposed to, at the time, Japanese cars that were far more fuel efficient. Check out those gas prices at this Arco. 89 cents a gallon. If you think it's weird that it says 89.9, it's not, because it's still like that. So if you look closely, there's a small 9 next to all the gas station numbers. So it's still like that. Like, gas is actually like $3.34 and 9/10. They do that just because they're evil. Here's a billboard: drive 55 and fight back against the Ayatollah. That is, conserve gasoline so we don't have to depend on the Middle East. Excuse me. Oh, bless me. All right, some successes. How about this of the Carter administration? Major goals as well were to decrease U.S. support for what they considered repressive regimes, because the United States was supporting some repressive regimes that were anti-communist. And importantly, to seek peace in the Middle East. We'll talk about Camp David. And then also the issue of this first major confrontation with a militant Islam. That's kind of, I don't know if that's an accurate label, militant Islam, because the Iranian Revolution was not like a militant type revolution. Yes, the people were angry and they overthrew their government, but it was very much a popular revolution there. It was in part religiously inspired, and what was established there was certainly a religious theocracy. That's redundant. So let's talk about Camp David. Camp David is this, it's like a retreat, a presidential retreat. Where is it? I think it's in Maryland. It's, near the White House, probably a few hours away, where Carter wanted to establish some kind of agreement between the Muslim leaders in the Middle East, including the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had been resorting to terrorist attacks. It was led by Yasser Arafat, the PLO, and then Israel as well. But there were barriers. Israel didn't want to deal with the PLO at all unless it renounced terrorism, basically. It was using terrorist tactics. So they wouldn't even talk to the PLO, which was the representative of the Palestinian people. But what they did achieve, which was a milestone, huge milestone, was to achieve diplomacy between Israel and a major Arab country in the region. So key players in 1978 met at Camp David at the invitation of the Carter administration. It's President Anwar Sadat of Egypt and the Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, and of course President Carter. So Egypt and Israel, and of course they were at war in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War. No Arab country had even recognized Israel as a country diplomatically. It eventually led to a peace treaty between these two countries, but many issues were still unresolved, like there was no resolution for the Palestinians in the Middle East, and other Arab nations would not agree to it. So Egypt became the first Arab nation to recognize the existence of Israel. There's a peace agreement. I'm pretty sure the Egyptians got a ton in return. First of all, they eventually got the Sinai Peninsula back from Israel, which Israel had occupied, I think, going back to the Six-Day War. But also, guess what the two biggest recipients of American foreign aid are on planet Earth? Number one is Israel, just because, well, they're this small nation. They're surrounded by a lot of hostile nations, to them anyway. And so the United States has always been an ally of Israel since its creation. And number two, it's not like a, war-torn country, or it's not a Western European nation. Egypt is the second largest recipient of American foreign aid. I think it's about $80 billion a year. And that probably came out of Camp David. Wouldn't surprise me anyway. So here's Anwar Sadat, Menachem Begin. So this is a momentous moment. Is that redundant? Man, I don't know. Anwar Sadat would pay for this, because many people in the Middle East, many Arabs, of course, hated to see something like this. He was assassinated by an Egyptian extremist. Well, it wasn't like one single crazy extremist. It was like a well-planned assassination by a group, actually. So he was assassinated in 1980, I believe. Another international crisis facing the Carter administration was Afghanistan. In 1979, 1980, the Soviets invaded that country because there was a communist government, and it was basically overthrown by Afghans. Many of them were religiously inspired. And so the Soviets invaded. The U.S. condemned it very much so. So Carter blocked shipment of grain to the USSR and said that the United States would boycott the 1980 Olympics. They did. And so in 1984, the Soviets boycotted the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984. Americans did not like this whole grain embargo or the Olympic boycott because they seem to hurt the United States just as much as they hurt the USSR. I mean, we didn't get to participate in the Olympics in 1980. That sucks, right? Especially for the athletes, especially for the fans. And then the grain as well. I mean, that took a pretty big customer away from the United States. So this further hurt the situation with Carter. But the thing that probably made it so bad was the Iran hostage crisis. So you know about this probably. I mean, you remember about this from last year. The revolution in Iran overthrew the Shah, which was supported by the United States, and replaced him with the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. That's his title, Ayatollah, or Supreme Leader. When they established the Islamic Republic of Iran, a theocracy, a mob of students from Tehran University attacked the U.S. Embassy and took the Americans hostage there for 444 days. That is not what the movie Argo is about. I mean, that's in there, but that movie is about like a separate operation to rescue three or four people who had fled from the embassy. Carter's attempts to negotiate went absolutely nowhere. Americans began to really hate Iranians in general. The bitterness between the two countries further deepened. And then this disaster where they tried to send in a military rescue mission of commandos, and it failed. Not only did it fail, the helicopters that were sent in to save them, they both somehow mysteriously crashed. There might have been like a dust storm. They crashed in the desert, and I think everyone died. This was the failed rescue attempt and the charred remains of the helicopters. It was pretty sad. And so the pendulum begins to swing the other way, and the rise of the new right, and we'll talk about this on Monday, the new right, because in the late 60s we see the rise of the new left. Very much leftist is the late 60s. So beginning in the late 70s, we have the rise of the new right, pretty much in reaction to a number of things. First of all, there's a variety of forces that converge to turn back this great society and form the new right, which is going to be more conservative, right? Conservative centers like the Heritage Foundation, it's still very active today. They're like a conservative think tank, and they do studies, they advise conservative politicians, and also the rise of religious conservatives who now encourage political activity. So before the 60s, most Americans were already, like Christians, and they voted with that mentality. That informed a lot of their opinions. The 60s kind of broke a lot of that down, of course. There was a lot of disillusionment, and then in the 70s, a lot of the drug abuse, the crummy economy, the Iran hostage situation, and then, gosh, disco. So what happens in the 80s is that people like Jerry Falwell, who died 2 years ago, and then Pat Robertson, who's still around, coined this phrase, the moral majority. And they were religious. I mean, they were Christian fundamentalists, if you will, who also advocated strongly Americans to participate in politics, but to do so like through the lens of their religious belief, primarily. So the New Right promoted its agenda also through tele-evangelists, that is, evangelists on television. The New Right politicians like Jesse Helms amassed really big campaign chests as well, and they were able to successfully block the ratification of the ERA. This is pretty significant. The Equal Rights Amendment was, I guess, kind of like the Civil Rights Amendment was, like for African Americans, especially in the South. The Equal Rights Amendment was for women's rights, and I think it had to do with like equal pay in the workplace, various other things, but it was blot, the ratification of this, it didn't pass through Congress, and a lot of people credit the rise of the New Right for that. They also began to advocate strongly to support the prohibition of abortion, or to make abortion now illegal, which had been made legal by a Supreme Court decision. So the election of 1980 sees Americans further disenchanted with President Carter. He went on television and he made this speech that is Nick coined the crisis of confidence speech. Americans have a crisis of confidence, and we need to find ourselves again. And it sounds pretty hopeful, but that's not what Americans wanted to hear. They wanted to hear that we're the best, that the red, white, and blue is just flies proudly, and you need to be proud of who you are, and just America type of thing. And this plan backfired. A lot of voters lost respect for him. They felt like they were being lectured again. And as the 1980 election approached, a very unenthusiastic Democratic convention endorsed Jimmy Carter for president. The Republican nominee, is very charismatic and witty governor of California, Ronald Reagan, who, by the way, was elected as the oldest president ever, asked voters this simple question: are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? That was the question. And that was the question that got him elected. He won 50.9% of the vote, but an overwhelming majority in the Electoral College. And check this out. As soon as he takes the oath of office, the 40th president of the era of national renewal, as soon as he takes the oath of office, minutes later, 52 of the hostages in Iran fly to freedom after 444-day ordeal. So it's possible that his administration or his people were somehow already in the works and in talks with the Iranians to release those hostages. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.